In the spring of 1934, residents of Nebraska's vast prairies observed a young boy engaged in an activity that baffled them. He wasn't occupied with mending fences, cultivating fields, transporting water, or repairing the barn roof, as was typical for lads his age on a farm. Instead, he was meticulously setting out rows of pine saplings around his family's barn. Row after meticulous row, seedling by seedling, each placed with deliberate spacing. His neighbors would pause by the roadside, heads tilted in curiosity. His grandmother, from the kitchen window, offered no comment. By the time summer arrived, chuckles about the young trees were common. Yet by winter's embrace, many would regret not having established their own. If tales of diligent labor, foresight, and country living resonate with you, consider subscribing and becoming part of our agricultural community. We'd be keen to learn your location in the comments section. Knowing where you call home would be a pleasure. The boy's name was Eli Calloway, and he was 12 years old. He had come to reside on the farm the previous autumn, following the untimely passing of his father, who succumbed to a swift and relentless fever. Eli's mother possessed no land of her own. Consequently, Eli was sent to live with his grandparents, Harold and Ruth Calloway, on a modest working farm situated just outside a small Nebraska town known as Grover Falls. Harold was a man of few words, his movements marked by a slight limp. Ruth managed the household accounts with the precision of tending a garden and never uttered a superfluous word. They were not unkind people, merely weary. Their weariness was a deep, ingrained fatigue born from decades of unpredictable weather and uncertain harvests. Eli did not lament his new circumstances. He learned swiftly and toiled industriously. He possessed a contemplative nature, observing more than he spoke, keenly noticing subtle details. He observed how the grass leaned just before a weather shift, and how chickens grew agitated preceding rainfall. His sole constant companion, a farm dog named Soot, distinguished by a dark smudge over his left ear, was always by his side. Soot faithfully accompanied Eli from the barn at dawn to the porch at dusk each day, without prompting. That spring, when Eli began transporting pine seedlings from the creek bank and planting them in measured lines around the barn, Soot would supervise from a comfortable patch of grass, observing the boy's work. News, as it invariably does in rural communities, traveled gradually at first, then with surprising speed. By the end of April, it seemed every neighbor within a 5-mile radius had an opinion regarding Eli's project. The first to voice their thoughts directly was Dale Mercer, whose farm adjoined theirs to the east. Dale was a man of 60 years, respected for his calloused hands and straightforward intellect, having weathered 3 decades of plains weather and possessing an intimate understanding of what proved effective. One afternoon, he stopped his wagon by the fence and rested on the post. "Son," he began, "you realize those trees won't offer much shade for at least 10 years, perhaps longer." Eli acknowledged with a nod. "Yes, sir, and they won't yield timber for another 20. "Yes, sir." Dale paused, expecting further elaboration. Eli offered nothing more, continuing his digging. The second dissenting voice belonged to Vaughn Oates, a pragmatic builder from town, skilled in repairing barns and outhouses and intimately familiar with the cost of every board foot of lumber on the prairies. He paid a visit one Saturday while passing through. That evening, at the feed store, he recounted to others, not with malice but with the tone of a man reporting a genuinely perplexing observation, how he'd seen boys planting a forest around a barn. "Seems like a considerable expenditure for mere decoration," he remarked. That word, decoration, took root. People repeated it, and it carried the particular gravity of a word that sounded sensible, reasonable enough to preempt further inquiry. No one asked the obvious subsequent question, save for Eli, who already knew the answer. The answer had been provided by his grandfather, Harold. During that initial autumn on the farm, Eli had sought out Harold and found him in the old storage shed. Harold was seated on an overturned crate, a well-worn agricultural manual open on his knees, its spine cracked and its margins filled with pencil annotations. "Come here," Harold had called out. It wasn't an invitation, but a directive. He revealed to Eli the pages dedicated to windbreaks and shelter belts, rows of trees planted to the north and west of farm structures to mitigate the wind's force before it reached crops, livestock, and buildings. This practice had been employed by settlers for generations, documented in agricultural journals as far back as the 1870s. It was not a novel concept, but an old one, overlooked by those who equated novelty with wisdom. Harold pointed to a sentence in the margin. "Wind expends its force on the trees before it reaches the barn." He then closed the book and, without further comment, handed it to Eli. Eli read the entire volume before winter's arrival, and by spring, he knew precisely what he intended to do. The trees did not thrive without incident. A dry August left the seedlings struggling. Eli painstakingly carried water from the creek, bucket by bucket, for 17 consecutive days. A severe windstorm in September toppled 12 stakes and snapped 3 young trees at their base. He restaked those that survived and replaced the broken ones with saplings kept in damp burlap near the barn. Then, one foggy morning, a dairy cow escaped its enclosure and wandered through the area, trampling 2 seedlings and stripping the top from a third. Eli discovered the cow placid and unrepentant. He repaired the fence, replanted what could be salvaged, and remained silent. When Dale Mercer heard of these setbacks and offered a gentle, "I told you so," Eli merely nodded and returned to his work. It was during that year that people learned Eli Calloway was not easily discouraged. October arrived with a sharp chill. The first light snowfall occurred nearly 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Livestock on several farms grew restless. Horses refused to settle, and dogs patrolled the porches after dark. The barn cats retreated into the hay for days at a time. Harold observed the sky each morning from the porch and remarked, "Less and less." An elderly gentleman named Ezra Voss, a resident of Grover Falls for nearly 70 years, who had witnessed phenomena on the plains that few fully believed, made his way to the Calloway farm one Tuesday in mid-October. He had heard about the trees, but he had not come to mock. He stood at the edge of the planted rows for a considerable time, gazing at the young pines. Though still young and years away from full maturity, they were alive and firmly in their places. "A severe winter is approaching," he stated to Eli. Eli looked up. "How can you tell?" the boy inquired. "The same way I know everything else," Ezra replied. "I've been observing this sky since long before your father was born." He looked back at the pines. "These trees won't be fully grown," he said quietly, "but they will offer some measure of protection." He departed without further explanation. Eli turned back to the rows and rechecked the stakes one last time. The storm descended on a Thursday in January, not with gradual onset, but with sudden, overwhelming force, as if the sky had been patiently waiting for months. The wind buffeted the barn doors so violently they shook on their hinges. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that water left outdoors froze before it could be brought inside. Within 3 hours, visibility had been reduced to 0. Farmers resorted to tying themselves with ropes to navigate just to check on their animals. Dale Mercer's livestock huddled in a corner of his barn, the wind penetrating a gap in the wall, leaving several animals distressed by morning. Vaughn Oates spent half the night battling drifts piled so high against his barn door that he could barely force it open. On 3 farms to the west, sections of roofing were torn away, and at the Calloway farm, a different outcome unfolded. The wind encountered the pine trees and diminished its fury. This is the effect of a windbreak. When wind strikes a line of trees, it doesn't cease. Rather, it is deflected upwards, its velocity reduced by as much as half on the leeward side. The protected zone extends downwind for a distance equivalent to 10 to 15 times the height of the trees. Even young trees provide a discernible reduction in wind speed. The barn rested within a pocket of calmer air. The temperature differential was perhaps 4 to 6 degrees, but on a night when every degree was critical, this was a significant advantage. Snow accumulated in the outer tree rows and stopped. Instead of piling against the barn walls, the livestock moved freely and fed. The brunt of the storm simply did not reach them. Harold tended to the animals at midnight and again at 4 in the morning. Eli carried the lantern. The hay remained dry and the feed bins were undisturbed. By morning, the storm had abated. Dale Mercer arrived 2 days after the tempest. He had spent those 2 days clearing snow and caring for animals stressed by the cold. He walked to the Callaway farm, driven by neighborly custom more than anything else, expecting to find damage similar to his own. He halted at the property's edge. The pine rows were bent in places, and snow had accumulated deeply along their outer edges, but the barn stood precisely as it had before the storm. The drifts against the barn walls were modest, and the doors opened without obstruction. He entered. The animals were calm, the feed was intact, and the water in the trough had needed breaking only once. Eli was present, cleaning the stalls. Dale stood in the doorway for a long moment. "How much of the hay did you lose?" he finally inquired. "None," Eli replied. Dale surveyed the interior, his gaze shifting from the walls to the floor. He stepped back outside and looked at the tree rows. After a prolonged silence, he declared, "I was wrong." There was no grand pronouncement, no ceremony, just a man whose life was built on integrity, unable to deny it. Eli offered a single nod. "It was my grandfather's concept," he stated. "I simply planted the trees." That spring, Dale Mercer established a windbreak on the north and west sides of his barn. By summer, 2 more farms had begun cultivating their own tree lines. Vaughn Oates dedicated a Saturday to assisting a young family with their planting, declining any payment for his services. There was no official announcement, no gathering. The idea disseminated organically, as practical wisdom has always spread across cultivated land, from person to person, season to season, quietly. Eli never boasted about his foresight. He continued to observe, to work, and to care for those under his charge. Old Ezra Voss visited once more that spring, observing the rows of young pines, vibrant and growing. "Nature has a way of rewarding patience," the old man murmured, more to himself than to anyone present. "What people ridicule today may become the wisdom everyone embraces tomorrow." Soot sat beside Eli. Harold leaned against a fence post, silent. He had already conveyed all that was truly significant years prior, in a quiet shed, pointing to a sentence in the margin of an aged book. "Wind spends its strength on the trees before it reaches the barn." As Will Rogers aptly put it, the farmer has to be an optimist, or he wouldn't still be a farmer. Eli Callaway was 12 years old when he planted those initial seedlings. He was 81 when the last of the original pines finally succumbed, by which time every farm in that county boasted a windbreak of its own. Have you ever faced ridicule for choosing a different path? Perhaps you embraced a more gradual approach, cultivated something that required years to yield results, or held on to an idea that others couldn't yet comprehend. Share your experiences in the comments. And if today's lesson from the farm, the kind that only flourishes with sustained effort, resonated with you, please remember to subscribe for more authentic rural narratives. We will continue to be here, as always, watching the sky and recounting the stories that the land remembers.